We have got a fast-moving constitutional crisis on our hands. It's been unfolding over the first 3 months of the Trump administration, and this week it has come to a head. As Even as the Supreme Court handed Donald Trump an extraordinary long leash in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was unlawfully removed from this country and sent to a gulag in El Salvador, known for its torture and abusive practices. The Supreme Court ordered that the Trump administration facilitate his return. But even with that wide latitude that the Supreme Court gave Trump, what the developments this week made clear was that Trump isn't even going to do that. He is refusing orders from the Supreme Court to even facilitate the removal of this individual to the United States, return to the United States. Tim Snyder, the expert in authoritarianism, who ominously has fled the country from his former home at Yale University to Canada, he writes this morning that yesterday the president defied a Supreme Court ruling to return a man who was mistakenly sent to a gulag in another country, celebrated the suffering of this innocent person, and spoke of sending Americans to foreign concentration camps. Snyder writes that this is the beginning of an American policy of state terror, and it has to be identified as such to be stopped. We could not agree more. My name is Alex Aronson. I'm coming to you from Court Accountability Action here with Midas Touch Legal AF. So thrilled to be joined by my partner in this work, Lisa Graves, and a very important and close ally and friend of ours, Pearson at the Center for Media and Democracy. So thrilled to have you with us. We're all trying to process what is happening day to day, week to week in this administration as Trump, really puts incredible pressure on the weakened guardrails of American democracy. And there's so much that we need to do now to mobilize a whole of society response to this autocratic threat. We wanted to have you on today to look around some corners coming ahead, because you at CMD and your team there have been doing incredible work to anticipate future constitutional challenges. Most notably, and as we'll focus on today, in the context of Article 5 of the Constitution and the plans from the same right-wing dark money network that is behind the capture of the Supreme Court, that is behind Project 2025, to steamroll us ahead toward a convention of states whereby right-wing legislatures, MAGA legislatures, could call for sweeping amendments to the United States Constitution. CMD has been on this case for years. We think it's of urgent importance that even as we focus on what's happening now, we understand where this agenda is heading and the stakes that it presents for all Americans. Aaron, welcome to Legal AF, and thank you for your work on this incredible new report on this constitutional convention threat. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Article 5 is and why this is so important for Americans to be aware of?
Yeah, sure. Article 5 is the section of the Constitution that talks about how we amend the Constitution. And within that, there are two ways. One is the one most people are familiar with, which is a constitutional amendment by way of Congress that gets sent to the states for ratification. The second route is for 2/3 of the states, now 34, to call for a constitutional convention, and then for delegates from those states to meet and propose amendments which get sent out to the states for ratification, but it would bypass Congress. Yeah. So with respect to what you were just talking about, the constitutional crisis that you're referring to has at least the benefit of there being a constitution that needs to be enforced. What the right wing is trying to do with their constitutional convention strategy is to rewrite the Constitution, and who knows what safeguards we would have at that point.
Yeah, I so appreciate your efforts on this, Arn. And for our viewers out there, Arn is my successor at the Center for Media and Democracy. I'm the president of the board there. And Arn has now been leading this organization for a number of years, but we started working together before then. And one of the things we worked together on was this threat of a constitutional convention. And in the early days of that examination, Arn, we were looking at how much money was pouring into these right-wing con groups, and how their vision for changing the Constitution was so radical, and in fact was tied to groups that were sort of militia type or very gun-centric groups, that they were doing, pamphleting at gun shows to try to get people to support this con, because their vision is of it, in fact, is not about just the budget or a constitutional, a budget amendment to have a balanced budget in the U.S., but is actually tied to making it almost impossible to regulate guns, make it, easier to regulate abortion than it even is right now, to make it harder to regulate corporations and environmental issues. I wonder if you could talk about both what the trend has been in these past 10 years of this con movement, and then perhaps if you could share some of the countervailing efforts to try to head this off.
Sure. So there was a big push for a constitutional convention around a balanced budget amendment back in the 80s that would, require Congress to operate like the states and not use deficits to counter crises and economic challenges. Um, and that came close to getting to passing, to being a convention call, but didn't get there. When Obama was elected, the right wing really kicked the Constitutional Convention movement back into action, and I think their vision was, after the gerrymandering of the 2010 elections, the Republicans were at their peak of power in the states, and meanwhile they had a Democrat in the White House and Congress. So they revived this push. So there are sort of two branches. There's the Koch ALEC constitutional, the balanced budget amendment strategy, in which they argued strenuously that it would just be the one amendment that would be up, and that there couldn't be a runaway convention. And that really at the same time, this other group came out of the Tea Party, a convention of states, has been pushing a much broader agenda to cripple the powers of the federal government, and their vision is really alarming. I mean, they want to take the country back to before the New Deal. Their leader, Mark Meckler, has said that the goal is to undo 115 years of progressivism. And when they held a mock convention a couple years ago, among the amendments they proposed were things like eliminating, rolling the Commerce Clause interpretation back to pre-New Deal, which it sounds like jargon, but basically means repealing virtually every civil rights, environmental protection, labor, et cetera, law that's been passed in the last 100 years. They want to turn public lands over to the states. You'll see a lot. There's in both efforts, there's a lot of oil money. There's Koch money. There's money from Tim Dunn, a lot of millions of dollars from Tim Dunn, who's a Texas oil man, a big player in the Tea Party, the Mercers, folks like that.
Aaron, I'm glad you brought up the Commerce Clause, as wonky as it sort of seems. We're talking about Wicker to be Filburn and the like, this kind of ancient body of law that recognizes fundamental congressional powers to regulate commerce across state lines. Other very important congressional powers, like the spending power, that have been the target of the right-wing legal movement for decades. Right, this is what we've seen the Roberts Court steadily assaulting, even in a case like the ACA case, the Sebelius case, where Roberts was heralded for saving the ACA, this signature healthcare legislation under Obama. He horse traded votes in order to land a huge, blow to the Commerce Clause, to limit Congress's ability to pass these types of laws under this fundamental congressional power. And we can see this same thrust from the court agenda to Project 2025 to disempower Congress, to strengthen the executive branch, to aggrandize the power of the judicial branch, and then to open up the floodgates for states, particularly right-leaning states, MAGA states, to be able to do whatever they want, whether or not the people nationally think it's okay, whether or not the federal government or the courts try to stop them. And so it's impossible not to look at what's happening through the state convention effort as part of this same attack on the constitutional balance of powers. And I guess my question for you is, so how we should be thinking about responding to this effort, right? On some level, what they're doing through Article 5 is a constitutional process, right? It's actually what the Constitution provides for in terms of if people in the states want to rewrite the Constitution and can reach, the threshold numbers to do so, this is what they should do. But what I think your report so helpfully breaks down is the extent to which this right-wing con effort has been designed to disempower people from that process, which is very similar to the ways in which this same scheme has been working to disempower the people via the representatives in Congress to pass laws to reflect our will in our government.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. The most of the rhetoric around the Constitutional Convention push is very populist sounding. Government overreach, and we've got to take power back from the federal government and give it to the people. Voters have absolutely no role to play in the right's vision of a constitutional convention. So the way they are trying to engineer this and have passed resolutions in 22 states, um, is to have legislative leaders, politicians, handpick the delegates in a lot of cases themselves, um, and then they argue that each state would have one vote. So you have Wyoming would have the same vote as California, which has 70 times more people. And when you do the math on this, right, what you end up with is the right wing, the Republicans controlling 28 states, so 28 delegate votes, Democrats 18 with 4 states split. So they've locked in under their rules, they lock in a supermajority right up front. And that's what Rick Santorum, former Senator Santorum from Pennsylvania, actually said this at an ALEC meeting a number of years ago, which we obtained a recording of, in which he said, the goal is to have super majority control, even though we don't have a majority of people who agree with us.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary, and I think that you've also raised, Arn, the threat we face from an improvidently called convention with the capture of the United States House of Representatives with Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House. As most Americans know, but I think it's worth underscoring. We've had one constitutional convention in the history of the United States at the federal level, and that was the convention that threw out the Articles of Confederation basically in their entirety, almost every single component, and replaced it with the current U.S. Constitution. And then there was a demand by the people to add a Bill of Rights to try to protect additional rights beyond that Constitution. But that Constitution is very different from the convention that was created or invoked to launch this Constitution. And that was before corporations were even ubiquitous, before we had this rise of enormous power and wealth concentrated, particularly in the hands of some right-wing individuals like Tim Dunn and others who have their own agenda, extreme agenda for this, for amending our Constitution. So on the one hand, what we're seeing play out at the national level with Musk and Trump is an attempt to accomplish many of these same policies just by fiat in contradiction to statutes and the Constitution. What this would do would be to basically constitutionalize all of this and more by the supermajority that you mentioned, this constructed, manufactured supermajority to get what they want as a constitutional matter. But I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about the concerns about Mike Johnson, as well as the pushback, for example, in the state of Washington and other states.
Sure. Well, let me pick up on the point you were making first, just to drive it home here, which is the right wing strategy behind a constitutional convention would essentially take Project 2025 and all of what's happening now and lock it into the Constitution for the next 200 years. And their game plan around this is, this is a point at which we have historic inequality of wealth controlled by the, oligarchs and robber barons, right? Who have the political ability to set the rules of a convention and thereby dictate the outcome. And so, that's the big concern. And I'll just mention that ALEC the American Legislative Exchange Council, is pushing a strategy now to try and force the courts to force Congress, to call a convene a constitutional convention. So they are shopping for red state attorneys general to file a lawsuit for a mandamus action that would then, in their hopes, get a court order telling Congress that the threshold has been met by the way they count. And they have what we call wacky math and the time machine theory. And they argued that you can aggregate different kinds of convention calls, and that the threshold was actually met in 1979, and Congress is derelict in its duty. So I think it's a crazy argument, but the courts would likely defer to Congress, since they're the drawback in Article 5 is that there are no rules, there's no procedure, there's very little, there's no detail in Article 5. So the concern now would be, with Speaker Johnson and Republicans in control of Congress, if they, wanted to say that the threshold was met in 1979, I sincerely doubt that the Supreme Court would stand in their way. So the pushback it has been, Common Cause and the Center and a number of other folks have been working for over a decade to expose this threat and do something about it. And the pushback has been to get a number of states to rescind their convention calls so that they cannot be counted. And I don't have the exact number, but I think the first wave of rescissions were around 7 or 8 states, which is great. And then once ALEC came up with its wacky math theory and started counting convention calls from 1789 for a Bill of Rights, it's one of them, or for the direct election of senators, so calls that were still on the books, even though they're moot. Then there has been a push to get those states to rescind their convention calls so that they can't be counted. And the most recent one was last week, which was Washington State, which rescinded all of its convention calls. And in the last year or so, New Jersey and Illinois also did.
Amazing. Aaron, I'm sure that our audience here is going to want to learn more, get involved with your work. One thing that I'm left with after this conversation is a real sense of a calling to continue to drive action to help people own their Constitution, right? This is a lay document. This is not a lawyer's document. If we're looking at what our adversaries are doing through the power that they now wield at the federal level and here at the state level, they are doing the politics of constitutionalism. We can see and we can show how bad faith their efforts are, how much damage they are trying to achieve, how anti-democratic in nature these efforts are. But at the root of it is a claim to constitutional power, to constitutional ownership that we in the pro-democracy community need to embrace, right, to fight against these efforts. So how can folks learn more about CMD, Center for Media and Democracy, about your work, get involved at the state level on these types of rescission efforts you're talking about, or otherwise get engaged in the fight around constitutional ownership in the face of this threat?
Well, the best way to learn about what we're doing on this is to go to our website, which is exposedbycmd.org. And on there is a ConCon project page, which has a lot of resources. It has a very short video explainer, which is very good. It has links to a lot of good reports put out by Common Cause and others in our report, and a number of really good articles that dig deep into this. And that's a good way to get connected into the community that's working on this.
And Aaron, can you share a little bit about Let Freedom Ring, which is coming right up?
Oh, sure. Another effort that the Center for Media and Democracy is engaged in is working with faith groups around the country to have houses of worship ring their bells on this Friday, the 18th, which is the 250th anniversary of the start of the Revolutionary War. That's when the Old North Church hung its lanterns for Paul Revere, and area churches rang their bells to alert the patriots about the troop movements for the British. So there, houses of worship around the country will be ringing their bells. We even have a lighthouse in Portland, Maine, outside of Portland Harbor, that's going to ring its bells. So, just a way to commemorate the American struggle against tyranny and the ongoing struggle against tyranny.
Incredible. We'll make sure to include a note in the show notes. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our work here at Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. Ring those bells, stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty. Until next time.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.